I cupped water from the test valve and drank it before I had time to think about what I was doing. Get a little in your hand, check the color, take a sip. Most of the time it tasted like metal and dirt. This water tasted like honey mixed with warm milk. It wasn't hot. It wasn't even warm enough to make steam. It just didn't have the cold edge well water usually carried. The water column was 8 feet down, according to the job sheet, and water at that depth should have been cold enough to hurt my teeth. It should have had minerals in it. Limestone, iron, maybe a little sulfur if the line was bad. Instead, it was sweet and creamy. I swallowed and looked down into the open casing. The steel cap was already unbolted and sitting at my feet. I'd taken it off before testing the valve, then noticed the brass plaque bolted to the side of the pump housing. The plaque had 4 lines stamped into it. They weren't instructions from the district. They weren't written like equipment instructions. I read them aloud because the pump house was empty and because hearing a thing usually made it seem less strange. Keep the pump running. The words sounded flat in the morning air. Never draw the water below the red mark. The red mark was somewhere below the rim, though I hadn't found it yet. Replace the offering jar every full moon. I stopped there for a second. An offering jar didn't belong on a water system. Neither did the last line. Do not answer anything that calls up the pipe. I looked into the casing again. Nothing called up the pipe. Nothing moved. There was just dark water far below me and a reflection of the sky that shook whenever the wind passed over the pump house. I figured the plaque had been put there by somebody with too much time and not enough supervision. Old ranch properties collected things like that. Hand-painted signs, homemade repairs, warnings about snakes that had probably been dead for 20 years. The assignment was clear enough. Pull the old pump, plug the hand-dug casing, install a modern submersible pump. The district wanted the job done before the next cattle shipment, and Phoenix wanted the water running properly before then. It wasn't complicated work. The well was old, but old didn't mean difficult. Usually it meant the parts were heavy and nobody had bothered replacing them. I'd done worse jobs for less money. Phoenix had explained the reason while we were standing beside his truck. The cattle refused the replacement wells. They'd cross half a mile of dry limestone pasture to get to this one, even when the other tanks were full. The cattle know which water they want, he'd said. They know what they're used to. Look, they'll walk right past the new wells. Half a mile in that heat. You think I'm paying for a replacement so they can keep doing that? I told him I'd have it finished before shipment if the old assembly came out clean. He said it needed to be finished, not probably finished. Then he drove away from the ranch to handle something in town. That had been about an hour earlier. I lowered my meter into the casing and watched the line disappear. The equipment gave a small beep when it reached the water. I waited for the reading, then wrote down 8 feet on the job sheet. The red mark was lower than that. I found it when I leaned over with a flashlight. It wasn't paint. There was no paint on the casing at all. The mark was a set of scratches cut into the metal from the inside. They ran around the casing in an uneven line, with some of them deeper than the others. It looked like somebody had taken a tool and dragged it around down there without being able to see what they were doing. I ran my finger over the nearest scratch. The steel was worn smooth at the edge. There were plenty of explanations for that. A dropped tool. A bad repair. Somebody marking the working level years ago and doing it the hard way. I didn't like any of them, but I could work without knowing which one was true. I just needed to finish the assignment. I carried my tools into the pump house. The building was made of pale limestone blocks and looked older than the ranch buildings around it. The walls were thick. The door scraped over the floor when I opened it, and a little dust fell from the frame. That was about the only dust I saw inside. The machinery had been oiled recently. The old pump was clean. The joints were free of rust, and the fittings had the dull shine of something handled often. It looked ready to run, even though there was no caretaker living on the property. Phoenix had said the ranch had been held in trust for decades. Nobody lived there full-time. There wasn't a caretaker checking the pump house or walking around the pasture every morning. The cattle were moved when they needed moving, and everything else was handled from town. That explained part of the plaque. It didn't explain why anyone had bothered keeping the pump in such good condition. A logbook was chained to a nail beside the machinery. I pulled it free and opened it on the workbench. The first several pages were filled with dates and short notes, one visit every month. The entries had been made by Lucas Evans. The name was written at the bottom of each page in a narrow hand. Every entry listed the date, the moon phase, whether the jar had been replaced, the water level, and the condition of the pump. 8 feet. Nominal condition. Jar replaced. 19 years of the same notes written over and over, with only the dates and moon phases changing. I hadn't met Lucas, but I knew the district records. He'd been a serviceman before me. The final page was different. The handwriting was still Lucas's, but the ink looked newer. It had been written across the bottom after the last regular entry, squeezed into the space under the pump condition. It knows a new voice. Do not let it hear yours for long. I read it twice. Then I took out my phone and photographed the plaque. I photographed the final page, then several pages before it so the district office would have the full record. The pictures came out dark at first. I moved closer to the door and took them again with the light behind me. I should have sent them right then. The district didn't like unexplained maintenance records. They liked equipment numbers, service dates, and clear reasons for replacing things. A monthly visit for 19 years at an unoccupied ranch, along with an offering jar and a warning about voices, would have brought somebody out to inspect the site. Maybe a supervisor, maybe a safety officer, maybe 3 people who'd stand around asking why I hadn't reported it before touching anything. That could have cost me the job. I'd already decided to finish the work before I took the photographs. The pictures were just insurance. If the district asked later, I could show them the record and say I'd found it while preparing the pump. I put the phone away and went back to the casing. There was an empty glass jar hanging from a wire beside it. The jar was about the size of a pint container, with a metal lid and a loop of wire twisted around the neck. It had no label, no dirt inside, no smell that I could make out. I held it up to the light. "Offering jar," I said. I put it back on the hook. I had no idea what it had been used for, and I wasn't interested in finding out before lunch. The district job had come at a good time for me. My farm had failed. Drinking had helped finish off my marriage to Paige. Those were facts, not things I needed to dress up for myself. I'd spent enough time explaining how one bad season led to another, and how I'd stop once things settled down, and how none of it was as bad as it looked from the outside. Eventually, Paige stopped listening. After that, I took the district position and kept it. 31 years of steady work was worth more to me than pride. I wanted honest money, and enough of it to keep my current life from falling apart. Rent, insurance, truck payments, groceries. Nothing impressive. Just the ordinary things that became difficult when you didn't have them. The work order required me to pull an ancient pump out of a hand-dug well. That was all it was. I connected the drawdown pump to the hose and lowered the intake toward the casing. The water level needed to drop below the working level before I could remove the old assembly. There wasn't a way around that part. The pump had to be exposed before it could be disconnected. I looked at the scratches inside the casing. Never let the level drop below those scratches. I started the drawdown pump. It took a few seconds for the motor to settle into its steady vibration. The hose jumped once against the casing, then held. Water began moving out toward the holding tank. At first, nothing happened. The pump house stayed still. The old machinery sat on the bench. Sunlight came through the doorway and made a bright rectangle on the floor. Then the water level dropped. I checked the meter twice. 6 feet. 5. The reading changed as the pump pulled the water down. The pump house began to shudder. It wasn't a hard vibration. The whole limestone building moved in small, uneven shifts, as if something outside was leaning against it. I put one hand on the casing. A deep groan rose from inside the pipe. I shut off the drawdown pump, but the sound continued. The casing rang. Something struck it from within. I stepped back and looked at the open pipe. The steel gave another hollow clang. then another, each one coming from lower down. It sounded like a pipe being hit with a hammer, except there was no hammer and the strikes were traveling upward. I reached for the pump switch. A voice came up through the casing. "Austin." It was Phoenix's voice. Not a voice that sounded similar to Phoenix, not a rough imitation. It was the exact voice I'd heard outside the pump house that morning, flat and impatient, with the same dry West Texas edge. "Austin." I stood there with my hand above the switch. Phoenix had driven away an hour earlier. I'd watched his truck leave the property. Phoenix was outside the property, but his voice was coming through the pipe. The casing rang again. "Austin, look, come on." I killed the drawdown pump. The motor stopped. The groaning continued for another second. Then the water inside the pipe made a sound like something shifting below the surface. I grabbed the reserve hose and dragged it across the floor. The tank was outside the pump house, already filled for the work. I opened the valve and carried water in a bucket because the hose wouldn't reach the casing. The first bucket splashed against the inside wall. The pipe rang once more. I carried another bucket, then another. I needed to bring the level back above the scratches. The job could wait. The district could wait. Phoenix could complain when he got back. I kept carrying. The water level rose slowly. My boots slipped on the wet limestone floor, and water ran down my sleeves into my gloves. I dropped one bucket and had to scoop it up again before it reached the casing. Nothing called my name after that. The groaning faded as the water climbed. The ringing stopped. By the time the level reached the scratches, the pump house was quiet except for the dripping water and my own breathing. I stood beside the open casing with my shirt soaked through and my hands shaking from the work. Phoenix's voice had come from inside the pipe. I had no idea what that meant yet. I only knew the plaque had given me 4 rules, and I'd broken one of them because the assignment required it. I stopped treating it like maintenance. I decided to follow the 4 rules and find Lucas Evans. I left the pump house with the water still above the scratches and drove toward Llano. The district records gave me Lucas Evans's address, along with a phone number that had been crossed out years ago. I tried it anyway. Nobody answered. The sun was going down behind the pasture. I kept thinking about the voice in the pipe, and it pulled my attention off the road. Phoenix had been gone for about an hour when it called me. I told myself I was going to ask about an old pump. Lucas lived outside town in a small house with a gravel drive and a porch that leaned toward the road. There were no other vehicles there. The grass around the place had gone brown, and the windows were dark except for one near the front door. I knocked twice. After a while, an old man came to the door. He was thin enough that the shirt hung loose around his shoulders, but he still stood straight. His white hair was combed straight back. He looked at me through the screen without opening it. "Lucas Evans?" He didn't answer. His eyes went to the district shirt, then to the truck behind me. I took out my phone and showed him the plaque. The screen was cracked from when I'd dropped it beside the casing, but the 4 lines were still visible. Lucas unlocked the door. "Did you draw it below the red mark?" That was the first thing he said. No hello. No asking who I was or what I wanted. "I started the drawdown," I said. "The level got close to it." "Below?" "I shut it off before that." He opened the screen door and stepped aside. I went in because there wasn't much else to do. The house smelled like dust, old coffee, and something medicinal. The front room had a couch, 2 chairs, and a television that wasn't turned on. There were boxes stacked along one wall. Lucas moved slowly, but not because he was confused. He pointed at a chair. I sat down. Lucas stayed standing. "You heard it," he said. "Something spoke through the casing." "What did it say?" "My name." His face tightened. It wasn't surprise. "What voice?" "Phoenix's." Lucas looked at the picture on my phone again. Then he looked at me. "It has already learned your name." I didn't say anything for a second. The refrigerator stopped running and the room went quiet. I could hear a clock somewhere behind me, ticking too loudly for its size. "Learned it how?" "You gave it to the well." I didn't tell it anything. You spoke near the pipe? I read the plaque out loud. Lucas nodded once. That bothered me more than if he'd looked confused. I asked him what was in the well. He walked to the kitchen and filled a glass from the sink. His hand shook while he carried it back, but he didn't spill any. There's something living in the water, he said. I waited for him to explain what that meant. He didn't. I looked at the glass. The water inside it was clear. Ordinary tap water. It caught the light from the lamp and showed a thin yellow reflection. You're saying something lives down there? I'm saying it lives in the water. That's not much better. No, Lucas said. It isn't. He sat across from me and held the glass with both hands. He told me the water had always been sweet. Not just clean or free of sulfur. Sweet enough that people noticed the difference right away. The first families at the ranch drank it because it tasted good. Then they noticed they were staying healthy for longer. The cattle drank it too. That was why they crossed the pasture to reach the old well. They weren't being trained to do it. They wanted that water. I asked how long the families had known. Many years, he said. Longer than the records show. He took a drink from the glass. He'd been drinking it longer than I'd been alive. It gives people long lives, he said. That was the bargain. What bargain? Lucas looked at the plaque on my phone. The rules. He told me the first rule kept the pump running. The second stopped the level from dropping past the red mark. The third required the offering jar to be replaced during every full moon. If it calls you, you do not answer. I knew that part already. I'd heard Phoenix's voice come up through the pipe and frozen with my hand over the switch. Why does it use someone else's voice? It learns a person's voice and uses it to call another person. To do what? Come closer. That was all he said. I asked about the jar. Lucas looked down at the glass in his hands. It holds blood. How much? A pint. He said it like he was giving me a measurement for pipe thread. He told me the jar was lowered into the casing on a wire every full moon. When it came back up, it was empty. Lucas had done it himself once a month for 20 years. I looked at his hands. The fingers were stiff and bent at the joints. There were pale scars along the back of one wrist, old enough that the skin had gone smooth around them. You bled into it? Yes. Every month? Every full moon. He had logged it in the maintenance book as if it were part of the pump. Jar replaced, water level checked, pump in nominal condition. The district never inspected the old well because the ranch had no resident caretaker, and Lucas understood that nobody looked very closely at a job that seemed to be working. That's why you kept going after you retired, I said. I kept it fed. You were retired. I know. You didn't have to keep doing district work. I wasn't doing district work. He set the glass on the table. The water inside it moved for a few seconds before becoming still. Keeping it fed was safer than abandoning it, he said. If it comes up, nobody knows what it will do. I thought about the casing ringing under the pump house floor. The sound had traveled upward from deep in the pipe. I'd heard metal struck like a bell, then a voice. Phoenix's voice. What happens if it comes up? Lucas didn't answer. I asked again. He looked toward the kitchen instead of at me. There was a closed door at the back of the room. It had 3 locks on it, all of them old. Lucas. He kept his eyes on the door. Don't ask me to describe that. I need to know what I'm dealing with. You're dealing with a well that has to stay full. That isn't enough. It's the part that keeps you alive. I didn't like the answer. I was already tired, and my shirt was still damp from hauling buckets into the pump house. My hands had stopped shaking, but not completely. I could feel the strain in my shoulders whenever I moved. The work order still required a pump replacement. Phoenix expected the job done. I asked Lucas why the ranch families had kept drinking it if they knew what was down there. Because it gave them time, he said. For what? He looked at me then. His eyes were pale gray and very clear. For everything they didn't want to lose. I asked what eventually happened to those families. Lucas sat forward and folded his hands together. The back rooms stayed closed, he said. They didn't bring the oldest members out in public. The oldest members were not brought out in public. What does that mean? He paused for so long that I thought he wouldn't answer. Each family eventually found a way to deal with its oldest members. He didn't say killed. He didn't say buried or moved or put somewhere else. I looked at the locked door. Did you manage somebody? Lucas didn't move. The clock kept ticking behind me. I could hear a truck passing somewhere out on the road. Then the sound faded. No, he said. It was the first answer he'd given that didn't feel complete. I stood up. Lucas watched me reach for the phone. I'm going back. You can't treat the replacement like ordinary work. I know. Keep the pump running. I will. Keep the water above the red mark. I know. Replace the offering jar every full moon. I don't have a jar. Then get one. I looked at the picture again. The brass plaque filled most of the screen, with the 4 rules running across it in dark, crooked lines. And the last rule? Lucas's expression didn't change. If it calls you, you do not answer. I didn't answer it. You heard it. That's not the same thing. It knows your name now. I put the phone back in my pocket. He'd spent 20 years giving his own blood to a well that was supposed to be part of his job. I thanked him. He didn't respond to that. He walked me to the door and unlocked the screen. The porch boards creaked under my boots. Behind me, the house stayed dark and still. Lucas stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, looking older than he had a few minutes earlier. I was concerned about leaving the well unattended. The cattle would keep going to it, and Phoenix would still expect the pump replacement before shipment. If the water level dropped again while nobody was there, the rules wouldn't matter much. I went down the porch steps and crossed to the truck. I left Lucas's house outside Llano, got into the truck, and started back toward the ranch. By the time I got back to the ranch, the light had gone thin over the pasture. Phoenix's truck was parked beside the well shed, and he was standing near the door with his hands on his hips. He looked at the service truck, then at me. You get any work done? I got the water level back up. That's not what I asked. I carried the empty bucket inside and set it beside the casing. The scratches were still hidden below the water. Nothing was moving in the pipe. The pump was running, just like the plaque required, and the sound of it had started to seem almost normal. I need to test the old assembly again, I said. Phoenix stared at me. You said it'd be done before shipment. I know what I said. Look, I don't need a story about an old pump. I need the line working. The line is working. Then replace the pump. I could have told him what Lucas had told me. I could have shown him the picture on my phone and explained about the blood jar and the voice that had used his name. The work order said to leave the pump running until I understood what the old system was doing. I'm working through a problem, I said. Give me a day. Phoenix looked past me through the doorway. The old machinery was still connected, and the new pump was sitting in its crate outside beneath a tarp. One day, he said. I said I'd check it. That wasn't what I heard. He walked back to his truck. Before he got in, he turned around. The cattle are already pushing toward this side of the pasture. If the tank runs dry, that's on you. I know. He got into the truck and drove away. I watched the dust settle over the road, then went back inside and looked down into the casing. I didn't have a jar yet. I didn't have a supply of my own blood ready to lower into the well. I had a canteen in the truck and a throat that had been dry since leaving Lucas's house. The first drink had tasted like sweetened milk with honey in it. I'd told myself that was just what the water did when it came out of the old casing. I'd also told myself I wasn't going to drink it again. Those were 2 different decisions. I filled the canteen from the test valve. The water came out clear. There was no smell to it, and no grit on the bottom of the cup. It looked like ordinary water except for the way it caught the light. The surface had a faint yellow color, almost like oil, but it vanished when I moved the canteen. I took one swallow, then another. It didn't make me feel anything right away. No heat, no dizziness, no sudden pain in my chest. I stood there waiting for some kind of reaction, but the only thing that changed was the taste in my mouth. I filled the canteen again and put it in the truck. I needed to know what the water did. I drank the rest of the canteen on the drive home and filled it again before bed. The water sat heavy in my stomach for a while. I expected some kind of sickness, but it never came. I woke once during the night, reached for the glass beside the bed, and found myself thinking about the well. The next morning, my shoulder hurt less. I'd injured it years earlier unloading a piece of equipment from a trailer. It hadn't been a dramatic injury. Nothing snapped, and I never went to the hospital. I'd kept working, which was how most work injuries became permanent. At first, it only hurt when I lifted something overhead. Then it started aching while I drove. Eventually, it hurt when I slept on that side. I'd gotten used to it. Pain could become part of the furniture if you left it in the room long enough. I moved my arm over my head before getting dressed. The joint pulled a little, but the deep ache was gone. I rotated my shoulder and felt something close to normal. I figured it was temporary. I took the canteen to work. For the next day, I drank whenever I got thirsty. I didn't empty it all at once. That seemed reckless, even for me. I sipped while checking the pump, while sitting in the truck, and while writing down the water levels on the job sheet. The cough cleared by the second day. I'd smoked for years, not heavily enough to call myself a chain smoker, but steadily enough that my lungs had started keeping track. I coughed in the mornings and after climbing stairs. Sometimes it caught me while I was talking. Paige used to look at me when it happened and wait for me to say something about quitting. I usually said I was cutting back. The cough stopped without any effort from me. I noticed it because I went through half a morning without clearing my throat. Then I climbed into the truck and drove with the window down. The air felt cleaner than it had before, even though the ranch still smelled like dust and dry grass. I stopped buying cigarettes. That part should have made me happy. Instead, it made me concerned. I kept drinking the water. Within a few days, I was sleeping through the night. I slept deeply. I started waking before the alarm. My back didn't hurt. My shoulder didn't hurt. I didn't cough. I could carry the tool case from the truck to the building without stopping to shift it from one hand to the other. I felt strong in a way I hadn't felt in decades, which was a strange thing to think at 31. Most days I felt older than I was because of the work, the drinking, and the years spent waiting for money to stop being a problem. The water had lifted all of that for a while. I went back through the district instructions and the old logbook. The replacement pump could be installed. I knew how to do it. I could pull the old assembly and finish the job in a day if I wanted. I didn't want to. The old pump was already working. The water stayed above the red mark. The cattle were getting what they wanted, and Phoenix was still getting water through the line. Replacing the equipment would only expose the well to people who had no reason to know what was inside it. Lucas had kept the pump running for 20 years. He'd logged the monthly visits as maintenance and continued collecting district pay after he retired. I'd keep the old well operating. I'd replace the offering jar every full moon. I'd record its height and the pump condition like nothing had changed. The district would keep paying me. Phoenix would get his water, and I'd keep drinking. The blood loss seemed manageable. A pint once a month was not nothing, but it wasn't enough to ruin a person who ate properly and didn't do anything stupid afterward. I could buy sterile jars. I could use bandages. I could keep the whole thing private. The part about voices was harder to explain, but I hadn't heard one since the day at the well. I bought the supplies in town. Sterile jars, wire, bandages, alcohol wipes, and a small container for the blood. I paid cash because the district card was supposed to be used for equipment, not for anything that looked like medical supplies. The cashier didn't ask questions. I kept the supplies in a box beneath the passenger seat. Phoenix asked about the replacement twice during that week. The first time I told him the old pump needed another inspection. The second time I told him the line was holding and I'd finish the change-out after shipment. "Look," he said, standing beside the truck. "If it's just a problem with the line, fix the line." "It's not the line." "Then what is it?" I closed the service box and locked it. The old assembly is still doing the job. That's not an answer. It's the one I've got. He wasn't happy with it. I could tell by the way he looked toward the building instead of at me. But the cattle were drinking, and the pressure was good. So Phoenix had little room to push without admitting that the well was doing exactly what he'd hired me to make it do. He left me with the old pump. I kept drinking from it. By October 17th, 2025, the whole thing had become a routine. I checked the meter in the morning. I looked over the pump fittings. I noted how high the water stood. I filled my canteen before leaving. The shoulder stayed quiet. The cough never came back. I could work all day and still have energy left when I got home. Sometimes I'd lie awake because I didn't feel tired, but that was different from the old sleeplessness. Before, I couldn't sleep because my body hurt or my mind wouldn't settle. Now I simply didn't need as much of it. I still slept when I went to bed. That night I carried the box inside the shed and set it beside the casing. The sun had gone down, but I left the truck lights aimed through the open door. The limestone walls caught the light and threw it back in dull patches. I took out the jar. It was clean and clear, with a wire loop already twisted around the neck. I wrapped the bandage around my upper arm and tightened it until the veins stood out. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me more than anything. I'd expected to feel sick, or at least uncertain. I was tired of being uncertain. The needle went in. Blood filled the jar slowly. It looked darker than I expected under the truck lights. I watched the level rise until it reached the mark I'd made on the glass. A pint. I removed the needle and pressed the bandage over the spot. My arm felt weak for a few seconds, but the feeling passed. I lowered the jar into the casing and paid out the wire. It disappeared into the dark water without making much sound. I waited. The pump continued running. The motor hummed beside me. Somewhere outside, cattle moved against the fence and made the wire give a soft metallic rattle. Nothing called my name. Nothing struck the casing. I tied the wire to the hook and went home. The jar was gone by morning. I told myself it had slipped off the wire. That was possible, even if I'd checked the knot twice. The casing was deep, and the water below the scratches was too dark to see into. If the jar had fallen, there was no way to know where it had gone. I bought another one. At the next full moon, I repeated the process. By then, I knew where to put the bandage and how tight to make the wire. I drank from the well every day. The second time I pulled the jar up, I did it slowly. I expected weight. I expected to feel the glass catch against something below the water. Instead, the wire came up with almost no resistance. The jar broke the surface. I pulled the October 17th offering jar from the casing and found it empty. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped drinking from the well and kept working. That was the plan anyway. I figured the water had fixed things that were already wrong with me, and once I stopped taking it in, my body would go back to whatever counted as normal. The water had healed my shoulder. It had stopped the cough. It had done something to my sleep. A cut on my hand was different. I'd caught my knuckle on a piece of sheet metal while checking the old pump. It wasn't deep. I washed it, wrapped it, and expected it to take a few days like any other cut. By that evening, the skin had closed over. The cut was gone by morning. The knuckle wasn't. It had swollen around the healed spot while I slept. The skin looked tight and shiny. I could bend the finger, but it pulled at the joint when I made a fist. I figured it was inflammation. Maybe I'd knocked it harder than I realized. I took the bandage off and left it uncovered. The next day, it was bigger. I stopped drinking from the canteen. I poured the water into the dirt beside the truck and filled it from a tap at the district office. I didn't go near the test valve unless the work required it. Even then, I kept my mouth shut and stayed as far from the open casing as I could. The hand kept growing. After 2 days, the skin around the knuckle had a polished look to it. It wasn't red. It wasn't infected. There was no heat or pus, and the cut itself had healed cleanly. The swelling just continued. My fingernails changed around the same time. They thickened at the base and started curving over the ends of my fingers. I trimmed them, but the clippers struggled to get through. The nails came out in pale, hard pieces that looked more like horn than anything growing on a person. I kept the pieces in the trash at first. Then I started saving them in a plastic bag. That was when I understood the water hadn't made me healthier. It had changed the way my body handled damage. Things that should have stopped growing didn't stop. Tissue that should have died stayed where it was, and more tissue gathered around it. It wasn't healing in the normal sense. It was preventing an ending. The cut sealed because the body knew how to close a wound. The swelling kept going because something had removed the part that told it to stop. I spent a morning in the service truck with my hand on the steering wheel, looking at the knuckle while the air conditioner blew dust around the cab. It had been 15 days since I first drank from the well. I checked the date on the job sheet twice because I'd started losing track of the mornings. The old pump was still running. The water level stayed above the scratches. The cattle kept crossing the pasture to reach it. I'd told myself I could manage the blood loss. I'd told myself a pint each month was a practical trade for a body that didn't hurt anymore. The next jar was already waiting in the box under the passenger seat. I'd bought it with the other supplies and kept putting off the second offering because I wasn't sure what would happen when I lowered it. By the time I took it out, my hand had swollen enough that the cuff of my work shirt pressed against it. I drove back to the ranch in the service truck. The pump house was quiet when I opened the door. The old assembly hummed beside the casing. I checked the meter, checked the fittings, and looked down into the water. The red scratches were hidden below the surface. Nothing moved. I used the same wire as before. The bandage went around my arm. I hated the idea of cutting myself, but the rules didn't have a section for what happened when the person doing the feeding changed his mind. The needle went in. Blood ran into the jar. My hand was steady. The swollen knuckle made it difficult to grip the glass, so I held it against my side while the level rose. When it reached the mark, I pulled the needle out and pressed the bandage down. I lowered the jar slowly. The wire slid through my fingers and disappeared into the casing. The pump kept running. I waited longer than I had the first time. The building smelled like wet stone and old oil. Outside, something moved through the grass, then stopped. I wondered whether the voice from the pipe was still wearing Phoenix's voice or had found another. Nothing called me. I tied off the wire and left. The next morning, I pulled the jar back up. It was heavier than it had been when I lowered it. The wire tightened against my hand, and I had to brace my boots against the edge of the casing before I could get it moving. I expected the glass to be full of blood. It wasn't. The blood had turned dark around a collection of pale clumps. They floated together near the bottom of the jar. Some were the size of grains of rice. Others were larger, soft-looking pieces that had pressed against the glass. They looked like doubled flesh. I set the jar on the workbench and stared at it. The clumps moved even though the jar was still. They shifted through the blood and pushed against one another, slowly joining into thicker pieces. I didn't touch the glass. I didn't need to. The presence was using the blood. It was taking whatever living tissue came with it and making more. It was material. I wrapped the jar in a rag and put it in the metal cabinet. The work order still sat on the bench beside the old logbook. Replace the pump, plug the casing, complete before shipment. I closed the cabinet and pulled out my phone. The district archive was in Llano, behind the main office in a room where dust and printer toner hung in the air. I'd been in there before, mostly to find equipment records and old inspection reports. The woman at the front desk looked at my shirt and pointed me toward the back without asking what I needed. I told her I was looking for historical service records on Hollis Cade Ranch. The files went back farther than I expected. There were pump reports, land records, animal counts, and short notes about the families who had leased or managed parts of the ranch over the years. The old well was listed in several different ways, but the same details kept appearing. The water tasted sweet. The cattle preferred the old source. The pump required regular attention. The families lived a long time. The first record of a person reaching 98 was filed as a health note. The next year, another family member was recorded as 99. After that, the numbers kept going. 100, 102, 104. There were no death certificates in the service files. There were no final reports. The records simply stopped mentioning people after a certain point. A note from one of the ranch managers said an elderly member of the household had become difficult to move. Another said the family had made arrangements for private care. A third mentioned that the back bedroom was no longer to be entered without permission. The language changed depending on who wrote it, but the facts stayed close. The older drinkers grew thicker through the shoulders and waist. Their joints enlarged. Their skin tightened. Their fingers became stiff. Some of them could no longer leave the house. The files didn't call it a medical problem. Nobody had written down a diagnosis. They called it a decline, or a complication, or a private family matter. The families handled the final years themselves. Lucas had told me they managed their oldest members. I'd thought he was avoiding the word killed. He was. The water gave them long lives, then kept those lives going after the people inside them had become something else. I sat in the archive room with my swollen hand on the table. My fingernails had curled farther over the ends of my fingers. The skin around my knuckles shone under the fluorescent light. The records didn't say whether the drinkers stopped consuming the water. Maybe they tried. Maybe it didn't matter by then. The final entries were always missing. I closed the folder and went back to the truck. I went to Lucas's. I drove there without calling. His old phone number had still been crossed out in the district records, and I didn't have a reason to think a call would help. Lucas was the only person who had maintained the well long enough to know how the rules worked. He'd kept it fed for 2 decades. He'd watched the families reach the point where their bodies couldn't stop growing. I needed to know how to stop mine. The gravel drive was empty when I pulled in. The same porch leaned toward the road. The same dark windows looked out over the dead grass. I shut off the truck and waited for a light to come on. None did. I knocked twice. Then I knocked again. "Lucas?" There was no answer. The screen door was locked, but the front door behind it stood open. I tried the handle. The screen door gave way with a dry snap, and I stepped inside. The house smelled different. The old coffee and medicine were still there, but the air had gone stale. Lucas was sitting in the chair across from the couch. At first I thought he was asleep. His head had fallen forward and his hands rested together in his lap. Then I saw the size of him. His shirt had split open across the chest. The suspenders were still attached, but they had pulled tight against his shoulders. His arms were swollen past the sleeves, and his stomach pushed against the waistband of his trousers. His face had widened until the old hollow cheeks were gone. The body was still enlarging. I watched the fabric move near his ribs. It was slow enough that I could have mistaken it for my own breathing, except Lucas wasn't breathing. His mouth hung open. His eyes were shut. The skin around his neck had stretched smooth and pale. His fingers were fused together. They had grown into one thick shape across the middle of his lap. The nails had curved over the ends, dark and yellow beneath the skin. There were no signs of blood or violence. He had simply continued after death. I stood in the doorway for a while. "Lucas," I said. I moved closer because I needed to make sure. His skin was cold where I touched the side of his neck. The body shifted beneath my hand. Not from a heartbeat. The flesh itself pressed outward in a small, steady movement. I pulled my hand away. Beside the chair, someone had scratched words into the wall. The marks were deep and uneven. They started close to the floor and ran upward beside Lucas's shoulder. I crouched down to read them. The message read, "The only release is to drain the well below the red mark and expose it to open air. It cannot survive drying." I read it twice. Below that, the writing continued. "Draining the well will release everything it is holding, including the extended life given to every drinker." The last part had been scratched so hard that the plaster around it had broken away. I looked at Lucas's body. He had known the well was keeping people alive. He had also known what would happen if the water level dropped. They were there to keep the presence contained, keep the pump running, keep the water above the red mark, replace the offering jar, don't answer the voice. All the borrowed years and bodies that had refused to finish. Everyone who had drunk the water and been held together past the point where a body was supposed to stop. He'd kept feeding it because he was afraid of what hunger would do. I looked down at my hand. The swollen knuckle had pushed the skin tight enough that the old cut showed as a pale line. My fingernails curled over my fingertips. They didn't look like mine anymore. It would give it more of me. I backed away from Lucas's chair and reached for my phone. I photographed the scratched message, then photographed Lucas. The district would send somebody if I reported a dead man and a growing body in his living room. They'd send somebody after the well, too. I stepped outside and crossed to the service truck. The morning had warmed while I was inside. Sunlight fell across the hood, and the gravel looked almost white beneath it. I got in and started the engine. I didn't take the archive files with me. I didn't take the jar from the pump house. I left both where they were and turned the truck back toward the ranch. The release instructions were still open on my phone. At every turn, I checked the picture to make sure I had the words right. Drain the well below the red mark. Expose it to open air. Let the thing dry. The work order required the pump to keep running. The rules required the water to stay above the scratches. The old drinkers were still alive because the well wouldn't let them finish. I had stopped drinking for 2 days, and my body was still growing. I had to reach the ranch before the next ritual. I made it back to the ranch about 45 minutes later. The sun was gone by then, and the pump house was lit by the service truck's headlights. I left the engine running so I wouldn't have to work in the dark. The new pump assembly was still sitting in its crate beneath the tarp. I didn't bother looking at it. The paperwork required a replacement, but it didn't know what was underneath the old one. I pulled the access panel and started disconnecting the lines. My hand had gotten worse during the drive. The swollen knuckle pressed against the steering wheel, and the nail over my index finger had curved far enough that it scraped the inside of my glove. I took the glove off and set it on the truck seat. I had another blood offering due soon, maybe the next night. I'd stopped keeping track of the exact date because every morning looked too much like the one before it. The jar was still in the box under the passenger seat. I wasn't going to lower it. The old pump came out in pieces. I removed the bolts, pulled the motor free, and dragged the assembly across the concrete. The weight pulled at my swollen hand. Either way, I got it clear of the casing and set it beside the wall. The opening looked larger without the pump over it. There was a black circle in the concrete floor, with the water far below and the red scratches hidden beneath the surface. I connected the drawdown equipment to the casing and checked the hose twice. The portable pump had enough fuel for the job. I'd used it before to lower water levels in irrigation lines and storage tanks. It wasn't built for anything as deep as the old well, but it didn't need to empty the whole thing. It only needed to take the water below the mark. I started the pump. The casing screamed. Phoenix's voice came through the pipe. Not a sound like him. His voice exactly. The same flat baritone I'd heard beside the truck and outside the pump house. It sounded close enough that I looked toward the doorway. "Look, Austin, shut that thing off." I kept my hands on the hose. The pump rattled against the concrete. Water moved through the line and spilled into the drainage trench outside. It was clear at first. There was no sweet smell. That didn't mean anything yet. The first water had always looked ordinary. "Austin." I watched the level through the inspection mirror. It had dropped a few inches. "Look, it's just a problem with the line." Phoenix had used that phrase whenever he wanted something to sound smaller than it was. The old pump had a problem with the line. The cattle had a problem with the fence. The delay had been a problem with the schedule. I didn't answer him. The voice stopped. The casing kept screaming. A few seconds later, it started again in Lucas's voice. "Austin, did you draw it below the red mark?" I put my hand on the pump control and checked the pressure. The needle shook in the middle of the gauge. The machine was doing what it was supposed to do. "Keep the water above the red mark," Lucas said. "Keep the pump running. Replace the offering jar every full moon." The voice paused. "If it calls you, you do not answer." I'd spent most of my life thinking rules were there to keep work from becoming dangerous. You followed the lockout procedure. You checked the pressure. You didn't put your hand somewhere you couldn't pull it back from. Those rules made sense because somebody could explain what happened when you ignored them. Lucas's rules had been different. They sounded made up after better options had run out. The water crossed the first scratch. I saw it in the mirror. The line had been hidden for weeks, but now the surface dropped far enough to show the red mark on the inside of the casing. It was only a short line, crooked and faded from age. The pipe cracked. The sound was sharp enough to cut through the pump noise. A split opened across the top of the casing and ran down one side. Concrete fell into the dark. The pump hose jumped against the floor. I backed away. Something moved below the opening. It came up slowly at first. A pale length of wet tissue pushed through the broken concrete and folded over the edge. It looked too long to belong in the casing. There were no clear limbs, but sections of it bent where joints might have been. The surface was white and soft, with thin strands of darker material running beneath it. The pump kept pulling water out. The body hauled itself upward. It dragged against the broken edge and left a trail of clear liquid on the concrete. The liquid ran toward the drain, carrying small pieces of tissue with it. I thought about turning the pump off, but the paperwork said nothing about a body coming out of the well. Lucas's writing had been clear. The instructions were clear. Lower the water below the red mark and expose it to open air. The body slid onto the pump house floor. It was longer than I was tall. I couldn't get a good sense of its shape because it kept folding in on itself. The middle section rose and dropped. The pale tissue stretched over the floor in wet layers. There were places that were skin and others that were muscle that had never learned what shape to take. The smell reached me then. It was sweet at first. Honey and warm milk, the same taste I'd noticed the first day. Then the smell changed. It turned sour and raw. It smelled of meat left in a sealed container. The casing spoke again. This time it used my voice. "Austin." I stopped moving. It wasn't an imitation. It had my rough tenor and the same West Texas edge I heard whenever I talked into the phone. It sounded tired. It sounded close. It sounded like me calling from the other side of the pump house. "Austin." My hand tightened around the control lever. It wanted me to answer. That was the rule. If it called you, you did not answer. I didn't answer. The pale body had started to dry. It happened along the outer edges first. The wet surface dulled and pulled tight. Cracks opened across it like splits in old paint. The tissue underneath shifted and pushed outward, but it had lost the water that held it together. The body made a sound that wasn't quite a scream. It was closer to air escaping from a damaged tire. The noise came from the casing and from the thing on the floor at the same time. The pump pulled more water from below. My hand began to slacken. The swelling around the knuckle had stopped moving. The skin still looked stretched, but the pressure had eased. I bent the finger. It hurt. That was the first normal pain I'd felt in weeks. I watched the nail over my finger. It stayed where it was. It didn't curl any farther. The edge had stopped pressing into the glove. The body cracked apart in sections. Pale pieces broke loose and fell to the concrete. Some of them moved for a while after they landed. They pulled toward one another in small, weak motions, but the dry air kept taking the moisture out of them. The pieces hardened. Then they split. I felt something leave me. There wasn't a flash or a sound. My knees gave out, and I caught myself against the pump housing. The strength that had let me work all day without getting tired was gone. My shoulders felt hollow. My back started aching. The hand with the swollen knuckle trembled against the metal. I sat down on the floor. The body continued breaking apart. I'd spent the last few weeks telling myself I'd found a way to keep going. The water had made that easy. My shoulder stopped hurting. My cough disappeared. I slept less. I could carry equipment without thinking about the weight. That hadn't been health. It had been borrowed time. Now it was coming due. My face felt tight. The skin around my eyes seemed loose when I wiped the sweat away. I touched my jaw and felt more bone than I expected. My hands looked older. The veins stood out beneath the skin, and the knuckles had gone sharp again. I knew what would happen next. The body had stopped growing, but I hadn't been healed. The water had only held the damage in place. Whatever years it had given me were coming back all at once. I'd be old by winter. The thought didn't surprise me. I'd already seen Lucas sitting in that chair, still enlarging after his heart had stopped. I'd seen what the end looked like when the water wouldn't allow one. I was concerned about dying, but not about dying normally. The thing on the floor dried into pale fragments. The larger pieces cracked open and collapsed inward. The smaller ones turned gray around the edges and blew toward the drain when the pump pulled air through the shed. Nothing called my name again. I waited until the last piece had stopped moving. Then I shut off the drawdown equipment and sat there listening to the pump wind down. The quiet afterward was almost uncomfortable. I'd gotten used to machinery filling every empty space. The water was below the scratches now. I took the steel cap from the back of the truck and carried it inside. The cap was meant for the modern pump connection, but it fit over the broken top of the old casing with a little work. I set it in place and tightened the bolts until the metal stopped shifting. I didn't install the new pump. The old well was sealed and the new cattle well was already connected to the tank. Phoenix would have to move the herd over there. That was a ranch problem. It was also a problem I could explain without mentioning anything growing in the dark. Before I left, I opened the test valve and filled a cup. The water was clear. I put it to my mouth and took a small drink. There was no honey, no warm milk, no taste at all beyond the stale mineral flavor of water that had been sitting in a pipe. I poured the rest onto the concrete and watched it run toward the drain. The cattle had started gathering near the fence by the time I drove around to the newer well. Phoenix was there, standing beside the tank with his hat pulled low. He looked at the pump house, then at the service truck. "You get it done?" "The old well's sealed." He looked toward the cattle. "And the new line?" "Working. Look, I needed both wells available. You've got the newer one. That wasn't the job." "I know." Phoenix watched me for a while. My knees hurt. My back hurt. The fingers on my swollen hand were stiff, and I kept it close to my side. "What happened to the replacement?" "I didn't install it." His mouth tightened. "You said this would be done before shipment." "The old assembly wasn't safe to replace." "Safe how?" I looked toward the sealed pump house. It was a problem with the line. Phoenix didn't like that answer. He'd used the same words against me often enough that he recognized them. But the cattle were already moving toward the newer tank. A few of them lowered their heads and started drinking. He watched them for a second. "They'll take this water?" "They will. The cattle know which water they want. They don't have a choice now." He looked at me again. I thought he might ask what I'd seen. He didn't. Phoenix had built his life around things that worked. If a machine started making a noise, he called it a line problem and found somebody to repair it. He didn't have time for a story about an old plaque. "I'll have the paperwork by morning," I said. He nodded. "Make sure it says the supply was redirected." "That's what it'll say." He walked back toward the cattle. I climbed into the truck and headed for the district office. The service call didn't take long. I recorded that the old well had been sealed and the cattle supply redirected to the newer well. I marked the pump replacement as unnecessary because the original source had been taken out of service. There were forms for the equipment, the water line, and the final inspection. I filled them out with my swollen hand and signed my name at the bottom. Nobody asked what had come out of the casing. I didn't tell them. I didn't tell Phoenix either. The district would have sent inspectors. Somebody would have opened the cap. Somebody would have heard the voice. I marked the call complete. By the time I got home, it was after midnight. I left the box of unused supplies in the service truck. The sterile jars, the wire, and the bandages could stay there until I decided what to do with them. I didn't have the energy to carry them inside. The house was quiet. I took off my boots and sat on the edge of the bed before changing clothes. My hand had gone down some, but the knuckle was still swollen. The cut across it remained as a pale line. It hadn't vanished. It hadn't grown over again. I lay down and felt every ache I'd forgotten. The pain in my shoulder was back. My lower back hurt from sitting in the truck. My knees gave a dull warning whenever I moved them. None of it was unusual. It weakened, healed slowly, left marks behind, and ran out of time in one direction. I'd spent the last few weeks trying to avoid that. Those reasons had been good enough while the water was helping me. They weren't good enough anymore. I kept the 4 rules memorized even after the well was sealed. Keep the pump running. Keep the water past the red mark. Change the offering jar every full moon. If it calls you, do not answer. I'd said them so many times that they had started to feel like part of my own thinking. I would age quickly. I would die normally if nothing else found me first. The first night passed without anything happening. The next one did too. I went back to work and stopped at the newer well when I needed water. It tasted flat and cold. I drank it because I was thirsty, not because I wanted more life. Some nights I nearly answered when a voice called my name from an empty room. It never sounded exactly the same. Sometimes it came from the hallway, sometimes from the kitchen. Once it came from the closed bedroom door, quiet enough that I thought it might have been the house settling. I never opened the door. I never said anything. The days went on. My hair started thinning around the temples. The skin on my hands loosened. I found a gray hair in the sink and left it there for a while before washing it away. I didn't go back to the old pump house after sealing it. The job was complete. The cattle had water. Phoenix had the paperwork he wanted. The district had no reason to send me back. The final sound came a few nights later. I was sitting in the dark beside my bed. I hadn't turned on the lamp because there was enough moonlight coming through the window to see the floor. My hand rested on my knee. The swollen knuckle had gone down again, and the nail had stopped changing. The house was empty. Then I heard my own voice from the darkness. Austin. I didn't move. It came from far away, from below the ground and through a long stretch of dry pipe. The old well was sealed, but I could hear it anyway. Austin. I kept my mouth closed. The voice waited. Somewhere beyond the walls, beneath the ranch and the steel cap and the empty casing, the last piece of it was still trying to call me closer. I knew it had learned my name before it dried out and died.